Our first speaker of the day, who is presenting a workshop on managing and expressing emotions at work. Super excited to have you, Liz. Thanks so much for being here. Liz Fosslien is an expert on how to make work better. She is the head of content and communications at Humu and a co-author and illustrator of the best-selling book, Big Feelings, and the Wall Street Journal bestseller, No Hard Feelings. Her work has been featured by Good Morning America, the New York Times, The Economist, Time, TED, and CNN. He's given keynotes about emotions at work at organizations including Google, LinkedIn, NPR, and Spotify. You can read more about her at fosslien.com. That's FOSSLIEN.com. And thank you so much, Liz. Take it away.
Amazing. Thanks for having me, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm sure you all have busy schedules, so I really appreciate you taking the time. I'm going to share my screen. Give me a second here to get everything set up. Perfect. Great. So, oops, too quickly. So I will be talking today about managing and expressing emotions at work, which is everything that I focus on. So as Jeremy mentioned, I'm the author of 2 books. I'll share a little bit more about those in a minute. I'm also the head of content and communications at a company called Humu, where we use behavioral science and nudge theory to help leaders and their teams take seemingly small actions that actually have a really big impact on how they and the people around them feel at work. And one of the things when I first started researching emotions at work that really struck me is there's a lot of absolutely wonderful high level advice, like be vulnerable, bring your whole self to work, fully in support of that. My question was often, though, what does it look like to be vulnerable in a meeting at 10 a.m.? If I really want to cultivate belonging, what are some clear actions that I can take to do so, whether I'm a leader or even maybe if I'm not yet a leader, I'm an aspiring leader. So this session will go through some of the science, but also hopefully equip you with a bunch of tactical tips. Some of it might work for you, some of it might not. There's not a one size fits all solution. So I just encourage you maybe to write down your top 5 things that you'd like to try following the session and experiment with those over the next couple weeks. I also always just like to give some context about my background before we dive in, because maybe some of you in the audience can relate. The reason that this is such a topic that's close to my heart is that I grew up in a very emotionally repressed home. I love my parents. I'm an only child. They're immigrants, they're academics. They also had me later in life. And so very much grew up with this idea that to be professional, you don't fail, you don't fuss, and you certainly do not feel. And so I studied a very quantitative subject, mathematical economics, got my first job as an economic consultant, and pretty quickly started to burn out. And that was surprising to me because this job had sort of checked all the boxes of success. It was stable, there was a clear career path. I went into a tall building and a high floor and wore my Banana Republic suit, all of these things that I had associated strongly with success. And the hours were incredibly long. The work ended up not being quite so personally meaningful to me, but I also didn't even know that you could job craft, that you could listen to which parts of your job you enjoyed and which ones you didn't, and maybe have a conversation with your manager about taking on more work that comes naturally to you, growing your career in a specific way. I was very reactive. So work was given to me, I would do it. The parts I didn't like, I just kept taking more of that because I sort of thought this is how I'm going to sort of grind through the next couple of years and prove myself. That manifested eventually as intense migraines, and I quit that job after 2 years and did not know what I wanted to do next. So that for me was very much this terrifying moment of, okay, I can't just suppress everything I'm feeling. That's not sustainable for me long term. So what the heck is going on? What do I like? What could I have done differently in that job? And that led me to emotions at work. The first book that I co-authored and illustrated with my friend Molly West Duffy is essentially the book that we both wish we had had when we first entered the workforce. We ended up putting a lot in there too about leadership. So it ended up being a book that's more broadly applicable to a range of generations and also people at different stages in their career. But this was definitely just an entry point into emotions matter. You're going to feel feelings, even if you're at work. And here are a couple ways to use that to your advantage. Molly had a very similar story, burned out of her first job. And I think, again, we both just wish we had known that there are things you can do by listening to what your emotions are telling you, and also that it's perfectly normal not to stay at your first job forever. Especially, I think that's becoming increasingly common that we actually find a new job every couple years or even dramatically shift our careers at some point. The second book, Big Feelings, came out this year, and this looks at, ironically, all the hard feelings. So Molly and I published No Hard Feelings in February 2019. And then in the end of that year, so this is fall of 2019, we both went through some really difficult times in our life. So I was losing my father-in-law to cancer, and there just was no positive to that. There was no affirmation that could make me feel better. It was just horrible. And so we came up with this idea for a book that's about emotions in work and in life, but really focusing on those things that are harder to move past or move through. And often when you're in them, don't feel meaningful. It doesn't feel like there's an easy fix or a conversation will solve everything. We pitched that book to our publisher in January 2020, pre-pandemic. They passed. They said, this is a depressing book. Nobody wants to read this. Fast forward, pandemic hits, the world goes through a lot, society sort of starts to reckon with a lot of injustices. And in June 2020, the publisher reached out and said, that book about really hard things, I think we're ready to publish that. So I share that anecdote. I'll talk about this later in the session, more as an indication too of how much our expectations or our willingness to share emotions, both at home and at work, really big emotions, have changed. Over and over, I've heard over the past year, especially from very traditional organizations, so think banks, law firms, that kind of place, people want to talk about feelings at work. We've never, ever had this happen before. What do we do? What do we tell our managers? What do we do as leaders? How do we still lead, but maybe open up a little bit more? So I'll cover all of that today. Again, the thesis of everything I do, emotions are inevitable. So it's time we learn to accept that we have them, acknowledge exactly what it is that we're feeling, uncover the need driving that emotion, and then figure out the next best step. This does not mean that you need to become a feelings fire hose in the office. But it does mean that maybe you do need to have a conversation. Maybe you need to take a vacation day. Maybe you just need to go to bed because you're tired. There's many things to do. And so again, useful to really understand what's going on within you. I would love to hear in the chat, anyone willing to share in one word how you are feeling today. So if you can pop that in the chat, I'll give you a couple, maybe a minute to think about it. I'll share a bit of when I do this with many organizations. And so I'll share a bit of what I've heard. I've heard a lot of overwhelmed, stressed, tired, excited. I've heard people combine words to tired and excited. So excited-ired. And yes, it's funny when I say that other people have said they're tired, that's suddenly when the tireds start to show up in the chat. So there's no good or bad. You're feeling what you're feeling. And I'm seeing here cautiously optimistic, excited but slightly nervous, curious, energized, fulfilled, focused. Great. Stagnant. Okay, calm and happy to be here, busy. Amazing. So keep them coming. I think it's just nice to see where different people are. I always like to open sessions with this, both to emphasize that we are all feeling a range of things in any given moment. What you are feeling is not necessarily what your colleague might be feeling. And then also, there's research that shows if people participate in a seemingly small way in the first couple minutes of a conversation, of a meeting, they're much more likely to chime in later. So if you're trying to create a culture in which there's equitable discussion, really, really great to start out with a prompt. Again, it can be very simple, one word, but it's nice to get people feel a little more comfortable sharing with each other. I'm seeing some more tired, anxious, curious, distracted, productive, optimistic, and supported. Great. Thank you for sharing. And yes, a big range here, which is, like I said, very common across organizations and groups. So today I'm going to spend the time first talking just overview of emotions at work, why they're important, embracing emotions as a leader, developing an emotionally fluent team, and I will define what that means, and then some time at the end for Q&A. I will say though, if there are questions you have, please pop those in the chat. Happy to take those as they come up. The goal here is really to make this informative and useful for all of you. And so if there's something that's unclear to you, most likely it's unclear to somebody else, and you're actually doing the whole group a service by asking the question. So I will be looking at the chat, pop questions in there, I will answer those. So to kick things off, just an overview of emotions at work. One of my favorite studies on this topic is Google's Project Aristotle. And this happened, I would say, 7 to 10 years ago. And Google's question was, what makes a good team good? And so the first thing they had to do was define good. There's many ways to define that. And it was hard actually to find a purely quantitative metric. So first they thought about maybe they could look at engineering teams and evaluate how many lines of code those teams were producing per hour. And what they found actually was that more lines of code isn't necessarily good. Maybe it's actually better if there's far fewer lines of code. So that was a flawed variable. Eventually, they settled on sales quotas. So was the team meeting or exceeding the sales quota? Because generally, more money is good for organizations. But they also decided to factor in some qualitative factors. So they interviewed executives, the team leader, and then the members of the teams themselves, and tried to understand what was each person's perception of how the team was doing. So they had this quantitative metric, how much money is the sales team pulling in, and then the qualitative, which is how do these different levels perceive the team's effectiveness and performance? Then using that, again, as their measure of a high-performing team, they looked at all the other data they had. So who was on the team? Introverts, extroverts, people who had been at the company for a long time, people who were new, people who were star performers, people who maybe weren't doing as well or needed some more support. And essentially what they found was that who was on the team mattered far less than how the team worked together. And how the team worked together, there were three key pieces of this when it comes specifically to emotions at work. Social sensitivity, so an awareness of how you feel, of how others are feeling. Equal participation, so I mentioned this before, but feeling like everyone can get a word in, everyone has an opportunity to share. And psychological safety. So people feel safe taking small interpersonal risks, safe asking a question, safe admitting a mistake, asking what an acronym stands for. People didn't hesitate to do those things. And so this study was written up in the New York Times Magazine. And again, just want to really emphasize that what distinguished the good teams from dysfunctional groups was really the way that people treated one another. So even if a team had stars on it, if they were not working together effectively, the team was not as good as it could be, or even as good as a team with, like maybe people who were not quote unquote as high of performers. So really to make a team greater than the sum of its parts, it all depends on emotions. Other research, this is kind of glommed from a bunch of different sources, but when employees feel cared for by their organization, they're more likely to recommend it as a great place to work, they're more likely to stay longer, they're less likely to burn out, and they're far more likely to feel engaged on the job. One of the people I interviewed for the first book, No Hard Feelings, was the Chief Human Resources Officer at LinkedIn at the time, who was Pat Waters, and she was in charge of LinkedIn's annual employee engagement survey. So every year they sent out all these questions. I think there were about 65 statements on this assessment, and people had to respond if they agreed, didn't agree, strongly agree, things like that. She wanted to test out this concept of feeling cared for by your organization, feeling a sense of belonging. So she decided she wasn't really going to ask anyone. She just stuck 4 additional statements in the engagement survey. So again, there's a 60 existing. She adds these 4. I feel comfortable being me. I go out of my way to help others feel belonging. When something bad happens, I still feel like I belong. And somebody just cares about me more than being an employee. 6 months later, she had her team, analyze the entire employee engagement survey to see which statements out of all 64 were most predictive of whether or not someone was still at LinkedIn. And what she found is that these 2 were the most predictive. So again, out of everything on the survey, it really comes down to these feeling cared about, feeling a sense of belonging, even when bad things happen. So really, really crucial to retention. So ultimately, if a company wants to succeed, it has to influence not only how people work, but how they feel and then how they can work together. Okay, so moving into how do you do that as a leader in particular? So embracing emotions as a leader. Couple things that leaders need to consider that individual contributors don't need to think about as long or as hard. So the first is that some emotional expression builds trust. So my guess is if I would ask all of you in the audience to think of the leader that you felt most inspired by, that you were most willing to go above and beyond for, you had some kind of personal connection. They showed empathy, they cared about you, they cared about your success, and that was ultimately what was motivating to you. So, really trying to emphasize that it's time that we shed this notion that leaders, professionals, don't show feelings. It's really important, especially we're seeing this over the past decade, but in the past 2 years in particular, people are really saying the number one thing I want in a leader is to connect with them on a human level, to feel like they care about me, all of these emotional components. Of course, there is a limit, right? So, example here, let's say that you are announcing layoffs, which is really, really hard, or you're rallying your team after a round of layoffs. So, on the one end of the spectrum, you could come in and say, layoffs happened. What's next on the agenda item? No one is going to want to follow you because you're just not, you don't seem trustworthy. It's not normal to have zero reaction in the face of really difficult news. They're not going to feel like they have space to ask questions, to voice their concern, and you're going to destabilize your team. Of course, on the far other end of the spectrum, you also can't come in as a leader and start sobbing and say, this is the hardest thing I've ever done. I don't know how we're going to get through this. I haven't slept in a week. I'm exhausted. I just am totally at the end of the line. I don't know how to move forward. Your team might be feeling the same. They might be like, oh, I very much understand what you're going through, but they're not going to feel like you have it together to lead them through this difficult time. And so they're also not really going to work for you. They're probably going to start looking for other jobs. And so being a leader is striking a balance between these two extremes. And I will share some tactical tips for exactly how to do that in a couple slides. People respond positively to empathy. So, again, if I asked you to think about the leader that you were most inspired by, probably a very kind, supportive one. And then as a leader, your mood has an outsized impact on others. What does that mean? It means that you have more information about the organization and you're in a position of power. And so people are going to try to read you as a way of understanding, gaining some more insight into what's going on their team and in the organization. So if you come in the morning and you're frustrated, maybe you didn't sleep well, but if you just come in frustrated and you don't say anything and you give no other indication as to what's going on, your team is going to pick up on that and they're going to assume that they did something wrong. They're going to assume the worst, that it's their fault, and then that's going to create this negative spiral. And again, it could have been absolutely nothing to do with them. So keeping in mind that your mood, the way you show up, has a really big impact on your team. The flip side is also true. So if you come in and you're really excited when a team achieves a milestone, that team is going to want to work for you because they're going to say, "Oh my gosh, that was so wonderful. My leader or my manager just is really on my side and recognize my hard work, and that's awesome." And they're going to want to keep working for you. And then finally, people are a lot better at reading us than we think they are. So James Gross is an emotions researcher at Stanford, and he ran this study where he made a bunch of people angry by having them watch an anger-inducing video clip. So these people are all riled up. And then he asked them, he said, suppress your anger. I want you to outwardly pretend like nothing is wrong. So they all kind of suppressed their anger. He had them sit around in a room. Then he brought in a second group who were not aware of what had happened and asked the second group, all the individuals, to sit next to someone from the first group. The members of the second group could not consciously identify that the first group was angry, but when they sat next to these people who were again suppressing their anger, the second group, their blood pressure rose. And so on some level, they were still able to pick up the emotions of the first group, even if it wasn't even conscious. Like none of them could say this person is angry, but there was still something going on that raised, they had a physiological response to this emotion that was unnamed. So again, it's a little harder for that to happen in a virtual setting, but it's useful to keep in mind as a leader that even if you think you're being cool and calm and collected, chances are, especially if you're feeling something really strongly, people are a little better at reading you than they might think. Illustration here, just driving this point home. So again, you say great job and people are going to feel great. I asked actually a bunch of people, what was the best part of your work week? What sticks out to you as an amazing moment at work last week? And one of the responses I got was someone had said that he posted something about his project in the company Slack channel, and the CEO gave it a thumbs up and said, I'm really excited about this. And again, it's one emoji and it's one sentence, and that made his week. So keeping that in mind, really small gesture, really big impact. On the flip side, you're grumpy, moods are going to tank. You send a curt email, moods are going to tank. And then you send a terrifying email like, can we chat later? And people are really going to get anxious. So again, keeping that in mind. So how do you walk this balance? It's by practicing something that my co-author Molly and I coined, and it's called selective vulnerability. So that means it's opening up as a leader, sharing a bit, while still prioritizing the psychological safety for your team. And another way of thinking about it is walking this line between sharing, which builds trust, and oversharing, which destroys it. So the formula for selective vulnerability that I like to share is to provide a path forward. So what does that mean? So if you think about it, selective vulnerability comes down to pairing a moment of openness with this path forward. So let's go back to this example of layoffs, really difficult thing to message. As a leader, what I might do if I'm practicing selective vulnerability is come to the meeting and say, this is a really hard thing. And I just want to acknowledge that people, you'll probably have concerns, you have questions. I'm here to answer those. You can also ask HR, point them to wherever they can go. I want to recognize that this is also hard for me. I don't want this to happen again, and I feel with you and for you. Here's what I'm going to do over the next 6 months to make sure this doesn't happen again. And here's what I need from you. So again, it's the moment of openness with that path forward. And what this does is it shows that you're having a human reaction, that you care, that you want to support people, but also that you are a leader who has thought carefully about how to guide the team through this challenge. Let's say you lose a big client. Same thing, coming in and saying, we lost this client. Obviously, this is a really difficult thing to contend with. I want to take some responsibility. I think there's a lot of work we have to do here. That might be difficult, and it's just difficult in this moment. However, here's what I think we can do to learn from this and to make sure it doesn't happen again. Again, it's this moment of openness, path forward. So a little script here that you might think about is because of the situation I feel, and then again, go into as much or as little detail as feels comfortable to you. Every individual, every team, every organization will have different emotional norms. So again, if you're at a very traditional organization, it might just be, this is a really difficult situation. I want to acknowledge that. Or it might also be, if you're in a very emotionally expressive place, you can share a lot more because of the situation. I am really going through it. Like, this is just really difficult for me. And then here's what I'm planning to do, the path forward, and here's what I need from you. So giving the team some clear direction about how they can help, making them part of that solution. So provide the path forward. And then flag feelings without becoming emotionally leaky. So one of the people I interviewed for the books was Kim Scott, who has written a book called Radical Candor, which is about giving feedback. Highly recommend. I'm curious if any of you in the chat have heard of her work. Definitely check it out. And she was a manager at Google for many years. And so she said she thought for most of her time as a manager, she came across as a very unflappable leader. So she was calm, she was collected, she could handle a crisis. Until one day, someone from her team came up to her and said, I just want to let you know that we as a team know what kind of day we're going to have by your mood the moment you walk in the door. Really different than what she thought was going on. And so she took a couple days to reflect on that. And what she decided to do was to start flagging her feelings. So let's say she had a morning where her kids were screaming, there was traffic, the coffee wasn't strong enough, and she just wasn't feeling good. She was angry, she was frustrated, she was stressed. She would come into the office and she would say, I'm having a morning. It has nothing to do with you, but I'm going to go and answer some emails and just take maybe 20 minutes to get into the day. And again, she didn't go into detail. She didn't talk about her kids, didn't talk about traffic, but she did flag that there was something going on and that her team didn't need to be worried. If she was running from one meeting to another, she would come into her afternoon meetings and say, it's been a really busy day. If I seem a little frazzled, that's why, but I'm really here. I want to be present. Just know that if I'm distracted in the first couple of minutes, it has nothing to do with you. So again, if you feel comfortable with someone, you can go into a lot more detail, but it's really about stemming unintentional anxiety. So you don't want people to read your bad mood because they're immediately going to think it's maybe something that they did. Put yourself in the other person's shoes. So, a question I get a lot from leaders is, should I share this? How do I know? And so, really thinking about how would I feel if my manager shared this with me? Would it be useful? Would it help me understand them more? Or would it feel a little bit like a burden? And the advice, I heard this from someone that I love, which is words are like toothpaste. Once they're out, you can never put them back in the tube. And so another piece of advice is put yourself in the other person's shoes and then sleep on it. So you can always come back and share. Once you've shared, it's much harder to take that back. It's impossible. Read the virtual room. So you come into a room, whether it's physical or into a Zoom, and let's say, or video call, and let's say that you see that everyone is distracted. As a leader, it's really valuable in that moment to put your agenda to the side and just to say, seems like there's something going on. Do people have concerns? Let's talk about it. I want to make sure that we can focus on the agenda, but first, I want to understand what's happening with people. And I think in a one-on-one situation, this is also really crucial. I've had leaders create, or I've known them to create structure around this. So one person I spoke with, she actually at the beginning of her weekly team meeting, she'll have everyone go around the room and she'll say, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the least, 5 being the most, how distracted are you right now? And if someone says 5, she'll say, can you take care of that distraction in 2 or 3 minutes? And often they'll say yes. It's an email that they just are thinking of that they really need to respond to. It's a message that pinged up that they just want to get back to. And she'll say, take the 2 to 3 minutes, go answer the email, respond to the message, and then come back. Because I would rather have you present for 27 minutes in this meeting than have you completely distracted for the entire meeting. So again, it's about just acknowledging people are going to have emotions and making it okay, creating space for them to share what's going on and showing that you want to support them. And then the final piece here is to figure yourself out. And for this one, I actually have an assessment. So let me quickly paste a link in the chat so you can just click on that. So I'd love for everyone to head to this link. And so it should take you 2 to 3 minutes to fill this out. I'll leave it up just a couple seconds more in case you just want to type it into your browser. And essentially what you will learn is your emotional expression tendency. So we all sit on a spectrum of emotional expression. On one end, you have under-emoters. So these are people that don't show as much emotion. And on the other end, you have over-emoters. So you have no poker face, you feel it, everyone knows, you have big emotions, you love to express them. And then in the middle are even-emoters. There's no good or bad. So there's benefits to both. I'll walk through that. There's no shame in being any of this. A lot of it is dependent on how we were socialized, the culture in which we grew up in, the organization. It's a little context dependent. So if you're new to a place, you might be an under-emoter. As you get comfortable, you might go more towards over-emoter, but we all tend to have some kind of baseline. Okay, so I'm going to be silent for about a minute, let you take that assessment, and then maybe you already know. Many people don't need to take the assessment to know what they are, but I'd love to see in the chat if you could share, are you an under emoter, over emoter, or even emoter? And we can also see kind of how the group splits. So take the assessment, or if you think you already know, then maybe paste in which of these you are. And I will share that I tend to skew towards over emotion. So that's good for me to keep in mind. Okay, does anyone want to share? Otherwise, I'll give us a little longer. And again, this is that link. Okay, we have our first, even emoter. Great, thank you for sharing, Jessica. Give people maybe one more minute. Even emoter. Okay, we've got two evens. Interesting. So it's funny to see. I did this with a over. Okay, thank you, Rachel. Our first over. I did this with a very traditional law firm, and every single person was an under emoter. And then I did it with a sales team at, they're very gregarious, and everyone was an over emoter. So it's always interesting to see there's some environments in which people maybe self-select or they kind of adhere to the norms. But this group seems pretty. Do we have any unders? We have only overs and evens. Interesting. Okay, question from Jess. Are there trends across cultures, age, race, or gender? Yes. Let me think. So culture definitely. So there's actually a really wonderful book. I'll type it in here. It's called The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. So if you're interested in cross-cultural differences, I highly recommend this book. She does a lot of research. She's a professor at INSEAD in France, and she does a lot of research around cultural differences. So so my family is all from like Denmark, kind of Northern Europe. They tend to be under motors, and that is very true for my family. Again, these are generalizations. Not everyone's going to fit into this, generalization, but tends to be true. Um, People in Asian countries, so Japan is another one where they tend to be under motors if you look at like an international spectrum. Italians tend to be over emoters. So again, Americans skew more over emoter. If you ask an American, how are you? They'll often be like, amazing, I'm great, everything's wonderful. You ask a Danish person, they'll be like, fine. And they mean the same thing. So yes, definitely cultural differences. Layla says Middle East, we tend to be over. And then the question was also age, race, or gender. I don't actually know the research. So race and gender, yeah. So I think a lot of this actually comes back to, so basically I've looked into this for historically underrepresented groups. So people who are historically underrepresented in sort of the traditional like workforce. So some races will fall into that, some genders will fall into that. And those people tend to skew a little more towards under emoter because they don't feel safe expressing their emotions. So definitely our culture, the environment that we're in will affect how much we feel safe expressing. And I'll often actually have people say, like, yes, at work, I lean under emoting, even though in my personal life, I'm totally an over emoter. And that's just because I don't yet feel safe in my work environment. So context does matter. Hopefully I answered that question. Age is super interesting, and I want to look into that, but I don't have a great answer for that right now. Okay, so let's see. Again, even over. We had no unders. So interesting. Okay, thanks everyone for sharing. So under emoters, I'm going to go through this quickly since there were none of you, but you probably will work with under emoters. You probably know an under emoter. And so it's still useful to kind of understand what their tendencies are. So under emoters. Feel things less strongly, maybe, but definitely don't express feelings as much. Often people mistake calmness for a lack of enthusiasm. So I spoke to one woman who was an under emoter, and she's a consultant, and she would say that she actually got feedback that initially, when she would meet with consultants, they thought that she wasn't so excited about the project because she was just very flat. And that was just her sort of normal demeanor. She was like, I don't open up until I get to know you. But that was feedback that she received. And so she started being a little more, enthusiastic than felt comfortable for her. Could be that gender factored into that, but feedback that she got. The upside of underemoters is that people really come to you for help and advice because in a crisis, in a really intense situation, you are able to kind of stay calm, figure out next steps, and negative emotions will not tend to stick their tentacles into your interactions as much. If you're a leader, though, again, it might be harder for people to trust you, especially if they are even or over emoters, because they're not perceiving that you're returning that emotional expression that they're putting out. So opportunities for under emoters. So again, useful if you manage an under emoter, work with someone, or ever find yourself skewing towards under emotion. Practicing emotional granularity. So this is pinpointing the exact emotion that you're feeling. So instead of saying, I feel bad, saying, I feel frustrated, I feel stressed, and then trying to understand why. So the more that you are in tune with your emotions, the more easy it will be to speak to them, to open up about them. There's a great, I don't have a link right here, but it's called an emotions wheel if people want to Google it. So it's kind of, there's the middle, which is like good, bad, something like that. And then there's all these other emotions. So it becomes more granular as you go out in the wheel. So if you ever have whatever your emotional expression tendency, if you ever want to start to really pinpoint what you're feeling, I highly recommend checking that wheel out. Leaning into praise and gratitude. So this is useful for everyone. Praise and gratitude are extremely safe forms of emotional expression in the workplace and as a leader. So getting excited for your team, thanking someone for their efforts, always going to be well received. And then never underestimate the power of a question. So I think often under emoters, I will share with them, you can ask a question and that can lead to just as good of a conversation as you sort of initially sharing a lot. And maybe as the other person talks, you'll find opportunities to share more. And final point here, and this is useful for anyone working in a virtual environment. So if you're ever not in person, I mean, even if you are, if you're sending an email, always, always emotionally proofread that email. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you get this email. This is a terrifying email to get, right? So from my boss, sent to me, I'm going to say, why was this sent so late at night? Why were they thinking about me at 11:03 p.m.? Very casual. There's no context about what this email is about, and there's no specific time. So I am going to assume I'm getting fired. I'm going to assume the worst. This is an absolutely anxiety-inducing email to receive. And again, it could be that the boss never meant any of that, but they're an underemoter, and so they just didn't think about how this might be received. And so instead of sending something like, let's talk, sending what you mean, which is, I have a few comments, but your edits look good overall. Let's chat tomorrow. Two incredibly, incredibly different emails, right? So an emotional proofread is taking that 1 minute, 30 seconds and saying, have I put everything in here? How might this be received? Just like what anxiety might I be causing unnecessarily? For really, really important emails that I have to send, I will actually email them to myself first so that I really go through the physical experience of seeing it pop up in my inbox, opening it, reading through it. The other benefit of that is I often catch a typo. There's something about hitting send that like immediately clarifies where all the typos are. Okay, over emoters. I saw a bunch of you, and I'll say so. The best leaders, probably unsurprisingly, act as even emoters, but they are able to kind of switch depending on the context. So in a crisis, really good to kind of make sure that your negative emotions are not spilling out in destructive ways. But also, if your team is doing a great job, celebrating that in a little more of an over emoter way. So over motors, you feel things strongly, you express them. People are really attracted to your energy and enthusiasm. People are going to come to you when they're excited about something. But they might perceive you as a little unpredictable, mostly in the sense that if you're having a bad day, it's more likely that that's going to rub off on other people. So opportunities, practice responding rather than reacting. So I define a response as I feel it, I lean into it, right? I'm angry, I immediately say something. A reaction is I feel it, I pause to think about how I want to show up in that moment. You can't always like walk away, sleep on it. So I saw a friend actually at dinner give a wonderful example of this where someone said something that clearly offended her. And she just very calmly, she said, she put her hand up and she said, I'm having a strong reaction to what you just said, and I need a moment. And what I loved about that was she was not leaning into her strong emotions, but she was very clearly flagging that something had happened that was not okay. And she also created that space for herself to figure out how she wanted to address the person. So responding, not reacting, requires pausing before engaging. Go to bed angry. So again, sometimes you're angry because you're tired and you're hungry. So just you usually don't have to have that confrontation right away, especially if you're not in person. Never send an email in the heat of the moment, especially if you're an overemoter. And then keeping in mind that tendencies differ. So for all you overemoters, if you are working with an underemoter, making sure that it's just like that's their tendency. It doesn't mean they don't like me. It doesn't mean they're not excited. They just have a different way of expressing that. Okay, I will stop there. If there's any questions, if you want to pop those in the chat. Otherwise, I will continue on to the next section. So I'll give you maybe a minute to think of any questions. I actually had a user experience researcher tell me when you ask a question, you should always silently count to 10 because people are really uncomfortable with silence, but often it takes people a while to figure out what they want to ask. So you don't want to like barrel through. So I'm going to count to 20. And if there's no questions, oh, great question. Any suggestions as to how to address under or over emotion in a report? Yeah, great question. So you can take this assessment back to your team and actually make it a team exercise and say, hey, this is useful because it will help us better work together, better understand each other. Have everyone take it. If they're willing to, you can also have them take it separately and then just reflect on it, maybe if people aren't as comfortable sharing. But it's useful, at least as a manager, to know what someone is. So the assessment can help with that, making it a team exercise. If that sounds fun to your team, great. But then it just gives you shared language to start this discussion. And so you might say, hey, the results showed you're an overemoter. You might say, like, I've noticed that you tend to, overemote in certain situations or that you really express your emotions. I think that is a wonderful trait in many situations, but there are some in which I think it would benefit you to think more before you jump into having a response. And the way that I always like to frame feedback is as bridging the gap. So saying, here's where I want you to be. I think that you can be an amazing future leader at this company or at the next company, whatever it is, but I believe in you and your ability to grow in your career. Right now, there are some situations in which you let kind of a bad mood permeate a discussion. And it's really useful if you have a very specific example so they can really learn. And then you explain how to bridge that gap. So here's where I want you to be, here's where you are. And to bridge that gap, I would recommend pausing a bit before leaning into your emotions. If you're having a bad day, maybe flagging that for other people so that you're aware that it's there and you're less likely to, again, have it rub off on someone. But I think it's a fine conversation to have. I would just frame it as mentorship and then be absolutely sure that you're giving specific examples and also then check yourself for bias. So it might be that you're an under emoter and someone who's an even emoter to you is an over emoter. So just really kind of thinking before you start that conversation around like, okay, what biases might I have? Could those be affecting my perception? Once you're ready to move forward with the conversation, framing it as bridging the gap. So great question. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to move on to the second portion. Again, I left time at the end for questions as well. So developing an emotionally fluent team. So emotional fluency is emotional intelligence, which many of you have probably heard, is just accurately describing what you're feeling and what others are feeling. Emotional fluency is doing that plus then being able to figure out what to do with it. So do you have a conversation about it? Do you, thank someone if you can tell that they're feeling underappreciated, things like that. So how do you as a leader develop a team that can do that with emotions, that can discuss emotions, that can leverage them to be better performers, to just form connections? So going back, this is again slide, we went over this at the very beginning. Emotionally fluent teams, I really like to frame it around these three things. So they have social sensitivity, people can participate, and they feel safe taking small risks. And really, I think what it comes down to is when all of those things exist, people just are more willing to share ideas. And that's, I think, really the crux of why this affects performance in such a big way. There's also really great research that shows that diversity on a team has a huge effect on performance if and only if people feel safe throwing out ideas, right? So that makes sense intuitively. If I join a team and nobody else on the team has my perspective, looks like me, whatever it might be, and they do not create an environment in which I feel like I belong, I'm probably not going to feel safe sharing my different perspective. And the team does not benefit whatsoever from a diverse group. And so really, really crucial when we think about diversity, also focusing on inclusion and then belonging. Okay, so how do you build social sensitivity within a team? As a leader, one of the best things you can do is start by checking in with reports individually, both to help them learn and grow, to kind of understand each other better, and then to see where are there opportunities for the team to work together better. Often people will share more with you on a one-on-one setting than they might feel comfortable, at least at first, in a group. And a couple specific questions that I recommend actually making these part of a standing agenda. So if people know that these questions are coming, they're going to be able to much better prepare for them and give you better answers than if you sort of pop it on them out of nowhere. You're probably not going to get as good of an answer, especially actually from introverts. So introverts research show really benefit from having that time to think through their response. So what one thing can I better do to support you? If you're an overachiever, you can also say what two things, what three things. But the thinking or the research behind this is that there's actually studies that show if I ask you, is there anything I can do to better support you? It's very easy for you to say, no, that's okay, and we move on. But if I say what one thing, I sort of force you to give me something specific that hopefully is actionable. So maybe it's, you don't respond to emails quickly enough, or I have this question and I haven't really known who to ask. Can you help me figure out? And those are things that as a leader, you can really act on. You can also ask, what one thing could I do to better support the team? And that might give you some insight into what's going on between the team members. Oops, let's not go too quickly. What kind of flexibility do you need? So I think this is a really nice one in terms of creating space for someone to flag to you if something's going on, but not forcing them to go into detail. So on my team, I ask this question every week, and sometimes I'll have people say, I have a doctor's appointment that came up unexpectedly on Thursday afternoon. Is it okay if we shift a meeting? And I say, totally fine. And they didn't really go into detail. Sometimes I'll have people say, like, my mom is really sick and I'm taking her to the doctor. And so again, it's either way, the outcome is the same, which is that I've given them the flexibility they need to be there for the people they love, to whatever it might be on their end. But I also haven't forced them to share more than they feel comfortable sharing. Is anything unclear or blocking your work? So when you're not together in person, this one is so important. If you're on a remote team, if you're virtual, and just asking that because research shows, and I think all of our experiences show, that when you're not together in person, it's much easier for one email to slip through the cracks, and then you, for whatever reason, you just forget to respond to it, or you never see it. It goes to a spam folder, whatever it might be. And there's just that question that you haven't answered, and it's hugely blocking someone's progress. And so making it really clear, this is the time to come to me and I will immediately try to answer you. It's also helpful for creating better bonds within the team. So often someone will say, this is unclear to me, but I actually don't even know who to ask. And then you can say like, oh, this individual has expertise in that area. I would talk to them. And so you're not only helping move progress along, you're actually helping people understand who knows what, which is going to, in the long run, really improve team efficiency. And then what was a win for you? What was a challenge? You can make this was a personal win if you want to get a little closer, but you can also leave it more open. This helps you as a manager, as a leader, figure out, okay, what should I congratulate this person for? I think often we're not even aware of what everyone on our team is doing, all the effort they're putting forth, especially if you're in a larger organization. There's so many people that are asking your team different things there's probably a lot that they're doing that you just haven't seen. And so having understanding of that helps you give insight into their capacity. Again, praise effort, offer recognition, and then the challenge piece, another opportunity to see where you can support them and maybe where you can support the team a little better as well. These are also great to do like in your personal relationships, honestly. My friend and I will sometimes text each other when we know that someone has a hard week, and I'll just say, hey, what can I do to support you this week? What one thing would be really beneficial? Okay, other things on the social sensitivity piece. So we had check in with reports individually, and then there's fill out how to work with me guides. So I did not come up with this idea. This is often referred to as a user manual, but Molly and I created our own version of this. And so essentially what this is it's a structured way to avoid miscommunication. And what we found is that it's really, really easy to bulldoze over someone's feelings if you don't know their preferences. So the idea here is you have every single person fill this out. You can do this asynchronously. And oh, Layla says this is very productive of my team. I'm guessing you did something like this. So it's very cool to hear if that's true. And yeah, and then you can come together as a group. And what I recommend is going around and you can have people like put together a slide where they go through their answers. You can say pick the two prompts that sort of were most important to you and share your answers. But it's really an opportunity to learn more about each other and then figure out ways to compromise. So I've done this many times, did it with my team recently. And what I found is that one of the designers on my team loves having heads down work for creative work in the mornings. I love doing my heads down work in the afternoons. And so what we were able to agree on is that as much as possible, when we have a meeting together, we will try to schedule it at like 11 a.m. or at 1 p.m. So we're still respecting that early morning time and the late afternoon time. So that was a small thing. So if you didn't see it, a couple prompts that I really love. I do my best work when I'm more of an introvert, extrovert. If you are planning any kind of team offsite, in-person gathering, this is a great one to know. A lot of introverts on your team, build in more breaks, right? Like don't have an entire day with no downtime. If you have all extroverts, great, go for it. Do the happy hours, do the lunches, whatever. But again, just useful to understand what kind of flows throughout the day might be best for your team. Best way to communicate with me. There was something question earlier about age. So this is a really good one if you have a team with members of different generations. So generally, there are differences in communication preferences. So older generations tend to prefer the phone more versus younger, which tend to prefer emails or even like texting or messaging. And so again, just getting on the same page about like, maybe we should have some norms around phone calls, around emails. Some people will say, any meeting that can be an email, please make it an email. And so that can start a good conversation around that. I prefer to give and receive feedback. So I actually asked some of my friends this recently, and I have one friend who's an extreme extrovert and one friend who's an introvert. And I asked both of them, how would you like to receive praise in your organization? And my extrovert friend said, statue of me in the front of the building. You know, I want to be in the newsletter. I want to be in the all hands, just like I want my name in lights. So that was the extrovert. My introvert friend said, I really never want to be called up in front of a crowd. That just makes me really uncomfortable, especially if it's unannounced, if I'm not prepared for it, if I'm surprised. So I would just always rather have it in a one-on-one setting or even over email. Really, really, really different responses, right? And so super important to know that so that you can honor their preferences. This is an example. So very different structure. So again, you don't have to use this specific handout. You can put in prompts that you think are unique to your team, your work environment. So for example, if you work in a retail setting, there might be very different things. You know, like if I have a hard day with a customer, what's the best way to make me feel better? Things like that. Yes, so most of these resources are on my website with Molly. You can download the How to Work With Me guide there as well. And then all the assessments are there too. So feel free to share those with anyone you like. So this is the design team that went through the same exercise, just a little bit of a different format. So you can see here they said, what's my superpower? I love that they have weakness and that they have, I want to be good at. So, you can say areas of opportunity. This is so useful to know as a leader, because if I see that this individual wants to be good at strategy and mentoring, immediately I know how to help them in their career. And I will look out for opportunities to have them grow in those areas. This person's an introvert. There's some fun ones, favorite Figma tool, which is a design program people use. And then again, best time of day and place to be productive. So I love this too. I don't have to be good at. I think it's a really nice way of, communicating what's not as important to you. Quick question from Rachel. Would you recommend all teammates have access? I actually would, but I think it's, if you do that, really important to say like everyone will have access so that people are aware of who's going to be able to look at it. You never want people to be surprised. So you can say, we're all going to fill these out asynchronously. However, we will share them in a shared folder somewhere. We will share them with each other in a meeting so everyone will see your answers. I want to flag that at the top, but please do try and be as honest as possible because that will help us work together. So I think, yeah, my preference is just everyone sees it, but make sure that you don't violate their expectations of privacy. Just says with the example on the current slide, it would be important to talk about what is meant by productive. Yes, absolutely. So again, I think on your team, you might even use a different word. So best time of place day for focused work, for creative work, for solo work, for collaboration. So yes, I love that call out. And again, shows that it's nice for these things to be flexible because there's always improvements. Same team. These were, maybe you can guess, these were designers. So they all designed their own cards. Again, it's another way to make this fun. This is an introvert, opportunities, favorite part of the design process. So I think this is also nice to know as a leader of like, what do they love? What should I give them more of? Which parts of the project should I really make sure to loop them in on? Okay, so how to work with me, guys. Equal participation. Some things here. Kick off meetings with a prompt. So I did this at the very beginning of the session, but I also do this with my team. So we have a team weekly every Tuesday morning, and we actually created a rotating role where a different person every week has to come with an equitable prompt that everyone quickly answers. Equitable means the question cannot be like, what is your favorite golf stroke? Because I personally do not have an answer to that question, right? Equitable prompt is like, do you believe in ghosts? Yes or no was one that created a lot of discussion. The one that led to the most discussion was, what food is most underrated? And what I actually loved about that one is people felt very strongly, and someone made an incredible pitch for cabbage, which they really convinced me that cabbage is very underrated. It's great as a crunch in a taco. It's, there's a lot to do with cabbage. But what I loved about that was that it also helped people disagree in a fun way. There's no stakes. There's hopefully not like really intense emotions involved. And so not only does it get people comfortable sharing, it gets people comfortable dissenting and still treating it with a lighthearted way. So even if later on in the meeting you disagree about something related to work, you've already had this kind of fun disagreement. And so you're less likely for that disagreement to turn into, like a personality conflict and more into a discussion of like, okay, which idea do we like? What creative direction should we go into? Split into duos and then share. So especially if you have introverts on your team, often introverts, it's not as natural for them to chime in a larger group. Extroverts get to something psychologists call burstiness really quickly. Burstiness feels amazing to extroverts. Burstiness is when you're in a room, everyone's like vibing, you're throwing out ideas, you're talking over each other. It feels like exhilarating to extroverts because it's the most amazing brainstorm. To an introvert, often it's chaotic and it's just, how on earth am I supposed to get a word in? And so by splitting people into duos, it's much more likely that everyone actually gets to share an idea, gets to talk through some things, and then you bring everyone back into the group and go around. Much more likely that you'll get equal participation that way. And really nice to do, on like a lot of video platforms, they have breakout room features. So it's kind of automated of even figuring out who those duos will be. Appointed meeting monitors. So you can give this person a different name too, but this should be also a rotating role. And this person's job is just, you can actually ask, what I've done in the past too is ask someone from another team to join and be the meeting monitor. So they have no stakes involved. Their job is simply to observe the team dynamics and then share back a little observation. They can share with the manager, they can share with the whole team if you feel comfortable, but it's things like, not everyone got to speak in this meeting. Someone tried to mute and unmute themselves many, many times and no one noticed and asked them to share. Someone's audio wasn't working and they were frantically trying to indicate that and no one paid attention. Or the meeting monitor might say like, that was great. That was a really equitable meeting. These are things that went really well. So again, it's just kind of an outside perspective, helping the team understand what's going well and what could be improved. A really, really important one is to recognize unique skills and perspectives. So this is one of the absolute best ways to encourage equal participation. And again, it takes almost no time. But if, let's say, Cindy is in the meeting and she takes a small risk and throws out a really differing opinion, I want, especially as a leader, I want to encourage that. And so I'm just going to say, wow, I hadn't thought about that. I really appreciate you sharing that perspective. And so it's just by saying that, I validate her risk, her decision to take that small risk and say something new. And you also kind of, what this does is it emphasizes to the team that we value people for what makes them unique, not for fitting in, not for agreeing with every single person. Even if you disagree, right? You could say like, you know, I actually don't agree with that, but it's really interesting that you brought that up, and I'd like to learn more, or I just appreciate, whatever it is you might want to say. Okay, we're almost at the end of the slides. I have a couple more examples here. So if you have questions, keep those in mind. I've set aside about 10 minutes at the end for questions, comments, anything. So start thinking about those, and I will go into the very last piece here, which is how to create psychological safety. So the most tactical and fun thing that I've come across is to create something called an "It's Okay to" list. What is this? So in an organization, often what happens is that when you're new, people talk about the culture, they talk about the values, the mission pillars, whatever it might be, and they all sound great. And then once onboarding is over, you never see those again, or you rarely see them again. And maybe you're not sure if they actually apply on your team. And so it's sort of like, what are really the rules? There's sort of what's being said, but what's actually okay to do on this team. And so what's really nice to do is to like codify this and have this be a practice that your team does together and that you revisit every couple months. So again, I will not claim credit for this idea. It came from a designer at the UK Digital Services Office. So this designer, he noticed this within his organization. So he asked every single person, hey, why don't you send me all your ideas for things that is explicitly okay to do on this team and that we want people to remember it's okay to do. So he got all these suggestions. He then made a list, had leadership approve the list. This was pre-pandemic, so he made these yellow posters that you see and hung them all around the office. And people loved these. And so they said things like, it's okay to say I don't know. It's okay to have loud days, to talk, joke, laugh, put your headphones on, say no when you're too busy, to not check your email out of hours, to have a messy desk, to have a tidy desk. I really love the ones that contradict each other because it's just a way of saying it's okay to be you. And then what they did is these were on the walls. So it was just like, yes, you see it. It's totally okay to do these things. And then they started every month or every couple months, they would revisit it and say, which of these, what do we need to add to the list? Which of these maybe isn't working as well as we thought it would? But it was a really nice way, again, this is when everyone was in person, of if someone, was like, oh, they're saying like ACB and I just don't know what that means. And then they would look at the poster in the meeting room and say like, okay, it's okay to ask. I'm going to ask what that means. So really underscored this idea of ask questions, that kind of thing. And what I like about this too, similar to the How to Work With Me guides, really flexible. So you can your list might look completely different than another team's list. It's also going to change depending on if you're working together in person, what you're working on. I've often had people ask, what if I'm in a consulting role or I work with, like, I'm a freelancer and I work with clients? Sometimes it's a fun exercise just to set, like, what are some norms for how we want to work together at the beginning of this project? So you can also use it in that way. Um, this one came from Google. So this is their chief marketing officer. And you can see this one was created during the pandemic. So there's some very pandemic specific, it's okay to. So it's okay to have dodgy Wi-Fi. It's okay to switch off your camera and have a stretch. It's okay to add some gaps and pauses to your day to think and rest, to put your family before your work, to ask for help, to have a cry. Again, you see two that contradict each other. Talk about it, not talk about it. Feel like these are crazy times because they are crazy times. Have a crappy day, have a great day. And what I love about this too is that they put on here, it's okay to have a great day and it's okay to smile. I think when the world feels really, really heavy, it is very easy to feel like you shouldn't celebrate a team milestone, or it's weird to recognize a work accomplishment, right? And so I think it's really nice to say, like, we acknowledge that there's a lot of stuff going on for people. Maybe we don't feel great, but it's still totally okay to, like, find moments of levity. It's totally okay to celebrate what we've accomplished together as a team. And then this came from IBM. So the interesting thing about this, this was also during the pandemic, started as a grassroots initiative at IBM. So a couple employees put together I pledge to lists. So very similar, different name. And the CEO found out about it, loved it, and used that to create an I pledge to list that they decided to commit to, and then posted that publicly on LinkedIn, which is where Molly and I came across it. And so you can again see it's so powerful if the CEO of an organization publicly commits to these things. So I pledge to support not camera ready times. I will not ask people to turn their cameras on while on video calls. I want everyone to feel comfortable. They can simply turn video off as needed. I pledge to be kind. I love this one. I will keep in mind that I'm showing up in people's homes for the first time and I want to be a good guest. I will not make people feel bad about interruptions or make someone feel self-conscious about their surroundings. So again, you can have anything on your list, but it's actually a really fun exercise to do as a team. I've run this exercise with many teams and it's so funny. What I do is I break people into breakout groups. So, 2 to 4 people per group. So come up with your it's okay to list, and then we'll share out, take your top 3 and we'll share them out with the larger group. And it's so funny to watch people. There was one where one group said it's okay to ask for an agenda in advance, and if there's not an agenda, not attend the meeting. And everyone in the room was like, yes, yes, yes. So clearly that was something that was going on within the team. But it was just interesting that no one had talked about that before, and yet it was something that every single person felt really strongly about. It's always interesting to see what you uncover. Okay, and that's the content that I have. Yeah, I'm happy to share a version of these slides with Jeremy that he can share with all of you. But yes, okay. In the beginning, you had 3 areas: psychological safety, participation, and great question, social sensitivity. So social sensitivity, again, is, understanding how other people are feeling, being receptive to that, being responsive to that, and then psychological safety, equal participation. Any other questions? I'm going to be quiet for a minute as people think. Okay. Kayla, I'm hoping I'm saying that right. If not, then please put the phonetic pronunciation in the chat. I struggle with getting an undermotor on my team to participate in weekly department meetings. Camera off, no questions, comments, concerns, any advice? I think this is actually where it's really nice to set team norms of asking that the cameras be on. I think it's people are influenced by what others are doing. Clearly, it's not totally working here, but if it becomes an explicit norm, if that's not a norm you want to set, one thing that I found that some managers have said does work is saying, we want to have a human connection at the beginning of the meeting. That said, I understand that you're in a lot of meetings all day. So let's have our cameras on for the first 5 minutes of a meeting, and then we can all turn them off. Or you can leave it on if you want, but then turn it off. So I think that's a nice way of making it not seem like this huge thing they have to do. It's easier for them to participate. Um, and then the other thing is, I think this is where kind of checking in. So it might be that there's something going on with them. Often being disengaged isn't that they don't care, it's just that they're burnt out or that there's something going on in their personal life. So checking in one on one. And then the last thing I might try is giving them feedback, and saying, I've noticed that you keep your camera off and I just want to check in. Ultimately, I think you do great work and I would love to like invest in your career. And I think it'll be really helpful if you invest a bit more in team connection. It's also going to help your performance. And so, checking in with them. Things like also breaking into duos. It's it's a lot harder to keep your camera off and say absolutely nothing when you're in a duo. Trying to have everyone being like, we're all going to go around and answer this really, really quick prompt. So trying to find these like small opportunities for them to start participating, and then that might be like help them kind of feel more comfortable, pull them into situations in which they want to participate more. Okay, Jess, new member of my team brought this question to our team and it helped with the above. What does active participation in meetings look like on this team? Ooh, I love that. That's great. Yeah, I think that's a great question to discuss. I think that's even, for like an it's okay to list, I'll often actually have people think through some prompts. And so like, what kind of culture do we want to create? What's working, what's not working? And I love this one. Like, what does active participation look like on this team? That's a really, really great prompt. So thank you, Jess, for sharing. Vera, again, hope I'm saying that right. Do you have a go-to exercise for establishing or developing trust, particularly for introverted persons? Um, yeah, so Vera, thank you. So let's see. On a one-on-one basis, I've found that it helps a lot to establish trust. To like simply ask, how can I support you? To ask, what kind of flexibility do you need? How can I help you recharge? I'm an introvert personally, so I'm going to be very quiet after doing this session today. But so for me, it's easier with introverted reports. I'll just say like, hey, do you have enough breaks during the day? What parts of your week are really exhausting? How can I help you address those? I think just showing that you really actively are taking an interest in how to support that individual builds a lot of trust. In terms of a team thing, um, I think a lot of it is there's like trust falls and trust walks and all that. To me, it's more effective to really create an environment in which people participate equally because that helps them get to know each other on a more personal level. And I think that's really what develops trust. It's usually not like one splashy thing. It's these like creating a list of these are the norms we want to live by, and then making sure that the team lives by those norms, embodying them as a leader. Creating breakout duos, because I just think people really what's going to establish trust in the long run is trying to understand or showing that you really care about their opinion and care about creating space for them to feel safe sharing that opinion. Did not know about recharging. Yes, so it's interesting. With introverts and extroverts, there's a big misconception that introverts don't like to be around people, they don't like people, they don't like being social, and extroverts love being social. And it's just kind of like it's sort of like that, but basically it really comes down to how you recharge. So if you have like you have a busy, busy day, at the end of the day, do you want to curl up in bed with a book? You're an introvert. Do you want to go out with your friends and let off some steam? You're an extrovert. So you can have introverts who are really outgoing at parties and are really social and are like the life of the party, but then they need to go home and recuperate for a day, right? So it doesn't mean that an introvert is always going to be like huddled in the corner at a party. It's more around recharging is really what drives the difference there. Okay, last question, just because I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Ashley says, what might a good response be when a team member asks for support that is against the organization's policies? Yes, great question. So as a leader, there are actually going to be many, many times when you can't take action on what someone says or asks for. And the advice I always give is it's still so crucial to close the loop. So often what happens, and not saying you do this, this is something I just see often at other organizations, is that a leader will hear something from a team member. It goes against the organization's policies. For whatever reason, they can't take action on it, and they just won't bring it up again. And what happens then is that the perception is that the leader never looked into it and doesn't care. So even if you come back and say, hey, I looked into that, or I really appreciate you sharing that with me, unfortunately, I can't take action on it because of this policy, or I can't, we can't do that right now. And then offering potentially an alternative. So I can't support you in this way because that goes against this organization's policies. Here's something else that might be useful. Can I offer you more flexibility on Friday afternoon? Is there anything else I could do? Again, I'm really sorry, but this is just unfortunately not something that I'm able to take on or change. And so what's helpful about that is you're being clear, you're being transparent, but you're also closing that loop. You're showing that you are not ignoring them. You did look into it, or you do know why. And then you're saying, like, is there anything else I can help with? And so people are usually pretty receptive to that. And it feels much, much better than if you just say nothing. And so the example that I'll share here, I know I have 1 minute left, was at my company, I worked with an organization where it was like a retail setting. And what we found was that the employees were really upset because management wouldn't let them wear nail polish at work. And management had never communicated why. And so the employees were like, these managers are micromanagers. They won't let us express ourselves. This is terrible. And I'm really upset with management. When actually it was a statewide regulation that if you work in food service, you cannot wear nail polish because the nail polish could chip and fall into the food. And then that's a health code violation. And so management had never ever communicated this. And so when they said that to employees, nothing changed. Like the employees still were not allowed to wear nail polish at work, but the attitude changed dramatically because it was like, oh, this isn't my manager coming up with a stupid rule and forcing it on me. They actually can't change it. It's like a statewide regulation that we will get fined if something else happens. And that completely, not completely, but for the most part, people did feel a lot better towards management because they just had never been told why. And so I think just communicating that can go a long way. Okay, thank you everything, and thank you everything. Thank you everyone. I've been talking for a long time. I'm starting to mix up my words, but I really appreciate you taking the time, and I will hand it back to Jeremy.
Thanks, Liz. There we go. Thank you so much. That was great, by the way. So much useful information, so many great tips. They can go to your website, right? Can you say it one more time so people,
Yes.
if they can find you and they can find some of the information there?
Yep, just put it in the chat.
Awesome. lizandmolly.com. So great. Well, thank you
All right.
again. Great
Thanks,
to have
everyone.
you.